Okay, we have our first keynote speaker of the day. I first became aware of Professor Gus John many years ago, and I was in absolute awe of him when I heard him speak, as it was very early in my career. And I remember thinking, I wish everyone could hear his wise words and be a champion for social justice. I was inspired by his willingness to help and be an advocate for those who needed him. We are so lucky to have him here with us today and speak truth to power. Professor Gus has been active in issues of education and schooling for close to 60 years. In 1971, he co-authored Because They Are Black with Derek Humphrey. He was then a staff writer on the Sunday Times. In 1997, Professor Gus was appointed advisor to former Home Secretary Jack Straw on race and social inclusion, and he advised on the Race Relations Act 2000. Professor Gus has worked at a number of universities during his career and has delivered numerous keynotes. We are privileged to have him join us today. Without further ado, I present to you Professor Gus Jon.
Thank you very much, Marcia, and thank you, Bernadine. I associate myself, friends, very much with Marcia's comments on Professor Tim Blackman's introduction. Absolutely refreshing and rare, if I may say so. If every higher education leader in the country were so disposed, I would begin to have faith in self-regulation within the sector. Sadly, that is not the case, and it is therefore a privilege to hear Professor Blackman's personal testimony and sharing his journey with us. What I want to do, I think, would resonate a lot with what he has just shared, and I want to say this: Bernadine and Marcia have talked about individuals who have believed in them along the way, assisted them along the way. Those individuals have been white. Marcia herself, in relation to Bernadine, is a shining example of what we as Black colleagues need to be doing with and for one another. And so in the remarks that I'm going to make about white allies, I want us to be clear that self-regulation and the scenario that Professor Blackman was describing to us, which thankfully obtains at the Open University, is not to be met everywhere, and it can never be a substitute for engaging with the legislation that Parliament saw fit to put in place at our insistence, if I may say so, in order to protect our rights. So I've called this presentation Conceding White Superiority, Embracing Black Victimhood. And I'm suggesting that that is no route to progression for African and global majority people in academia. And you would note that I have used the term African and global majority because I have a passionate detestation for BAME. Okay. This conference, as I'm sure our colleagues before have been saying, all of them, continues to be both necessary and desirable because we have so much to share and to give to one another in our own right as a rich, diverse, hugely talented and proud body of people, coming from our different backgrounds and with our wide range of aspirations, as to how academia could facilitate us to achieve our potential and to do and be the best we can in the service of our communities and of society generally. And that's even before we begin to engage with the barriers and obstacles we are made to contend with every day on the axis of culture, race, class, religion and belief, sexuality, and much else besides. It is these structural and institutional barriers and how we transcend them and resist their impact upon us, our well-being, physical, mental, spiritual, and our careers that I want to address in this presentation. I would like to think that no one in this company would disagree with my premise that all African and global majority people want to do, and indeed have a right to do, is to enjoy equity and to flourish within academia through equality of opportunity, equality of access, including access to opportunities for career advancement, opportunities for self-expression, for creativity, for sharing through teaching and learning in formal, informal, and non-formal settings, the pursuit of goals and aspirations, and the opportunity to make a difference. It is the well-documented experience of AGM people that no such culture of equity exists within the sector, and the commitment to eliminating barriers and to putting in place measures to root out unlawful discrimination and subtle forms of othering and exclusion cannot be assumed, despite the policy statements that are circulated by institutions and the governing councils. And those have abounded, as many of us have experienced, since the murder of George Floyd in 2020. This mismatch between the rights and justifiable expectations of AGM staff and students on the one hand, and the stark racist reality within most HE institutions has existed for at least half a century. The sad irony, however, is that the more our numbers grow, the more visible we become within the sector, is the more underrepresented we are in its management structures and its corporate plans, strategic priorities, and the rest. In other words, as I had cause to say recently, the higher education sector is increasingly afraid of its shadow when it comes to discussing issues to do with race, racism, and colonialism. In the light of all that, then, what forms has our response taken? I want to discuss two interrelated events, which in my view exemplify the title for this presentation: Conceding White Superiority, Embracing Black Victimhood. In 2020, an open letter signed by almost 400 academics of different ethnicities and other staff in higher education to be sent to Gavin Williamson called on the government to, quote, make available ring-fenced funding for the Equality and Human Rights Commission to oversee the implementation of a range of actions, to identify any further disparities in experiences and outcomes, and to work with relevant parties, including the Office for Students, to ensure their implementation. The letter embraces the notion of allies and allyship, referring to signatories who do not identify as AGM as our allies, a term whose meaning the letter rather took for granted and clearly assumed to be totally unproblematic. But as I argued in my reasons for not signing the letter, casting non-AGM folk in the role of allies rather suggests that they are joining us in our mission to tackle racial injustice, in higher education, and as such, working to an agenda and under our leadership. But the burden of expunging racism from the society and its institutions, including higher education, is not the Black man's or the Black woman's burden. We endure racism in its structural, cultural, institutional, and personal manifestations in a society that validates white people automatically and puts us through various filters before we are judged capable, competent, and able to fit in. We neither create nor perpetuate racism. White people inhabit and sustain racist cultures and environments which we experience as hostile, inhospitable, and injurious to our wellness and well-being. Those environments place a stamp of validation automatically on white folk. When our allies accept and are happy to live with that situation as the status quo, or themselves constitute that status quo, they do not become comrades in arms simply by choosing to join our struggle for racial justice. They become our allies when they put their own career progression at risk and independently of us, challenge those structures because they have no desire to be part of an institution that denies leadership and management opportunity to AGM people and does not actively promote racial justice and a culture of equity. And that is why Professor Tim Blackman stands out. They thus become agents, active agents of change, acting with what I call moral purpose and with active self-interest within their institutions to right racial wrongs and eliminate racism in all its manifestations, rather than acting as allies in our struggle for racial justice. It seems to me to be as obvious as daylight that to make combating racism in HE dependent upon white allies is to disempower ourselves and make the delivery of our fundamental rights and entitlements contingent upon the disposition and interventions of whites who are sympathetic to our cause and are willing to use their positionality as part of the in-group, the validated group, to advocate on our behalf, thus confirming us in our victim and marginalized status. In this regard, the immortal words of Malcolm X over 50 years ago still have resonance today. I have these very deep feelings, Malcolm said, that white people who want to join Black organizations are really just taking the escapist way to salve their consciences. By visibly hovering near us, they are proving that they are with us. But the hard truth is, this isn't helping to solve America's racist problem. The Negroes aren't the racists. Where the really sincere white people have got to do the proving of themselves is not among the Black victims, but on the battle lines of where America's racism really is, and that is in their own home communities. America's racism is among their own fellow whites. That's where sincere whites who really mean to accomplish something have got to work. For me, the most disturbing part of that open letter I mentioned was this statement. We believe the groundswell of protests in the US and the UK in the wake of the George Floyd's murder represent a crucial moment for us as people directly affected by these issues, to call on the sector for help in eliminating racism. A more peculiar statement I've never encountered. So here's a body of AGM staff and their allies in higher education calling on the sector to help us get its knee off our necks. I mean, this language of allies and help projects global majority people in the sector as victims pleading for mercy and for support, as distinct from protagonists demanding equal rights and justice. The sector has a legal obligation to eliminate racism. Tim mentioned the 1976 Race Relations Act. That legal obligation existed particularly since then. The sector has to do so systematically and with verifiable evidence. Without their help, without the help of Black and global majority staff and students. So therefore, it is not a matter of the sector deciding whether or not to help African and global majority people eliminate racism. But what is extraordinary is that that open letter did not mention even once the Equality Act 2010, nor the Race Relations Act of 2000, and it requires what it requires higher education to do. But I'll return to that in a moment. The second event I wish to explore is more contemporary. It is an online survey on white allyship, which was due to be completed a few days ago, Monday, the 5th of July. The White Allies Project says of the purpose of the survey this: we are carrying out a survey about white colleagues who have supported racial justice in the workplace. Specifically, the aim of the research is to identify the characteristics and motivations of white allies in order to support those colleagues who were earlier on in their journey, but are keen to learn to be actively anti-racist. The project defines white allies as follows. A white ally can be described as someone who is white, who speaks out on behalf of or takes explicit action to support or advocate on behalf of those from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. So the defining issue, therefore, appears to be white colleagues supporting racial justice in the workplace and doing so by taking explicit action to support or advocate on behalf of African and global majority people. The emphasis is on supporting white colleagues who are earlier on in their journey but are keen to learn how to be actively anti-racist. It could be inferred from the project's definition that those from white backgrounds, students especially, should not similarly have a legitimate expectation that white allies would take explicit action to advocate on their behalf and support them in the efforts to make curriculum less Eurocentric and racist, to decolonize curriculum and decolonize the institution as a prerequisite of that. The survey questions suggest that the sector should be seeking to institutionalize white allyship. Look at the following questions, for example. Has your workplace held workshops or training which has included content about how to be a white ally in the last 18 months? Has your workplace hosted talks that have included content about white allyship in the last 18 months? In your view, have the training or talks about anti-racism and white allyship in your workplace been as a result of the death of George Floyd? What could your organization do to encourage more white people to become allies on race? Well, the first and most obvious answer to that is to fulfill the requirements of the legislation. The White Allies Project appears to want the survey to assist them in constructing what I call an ideal type of white ally. A raft of questions relates to the characteristics of allyship, the conduct that defines an ally, principally advocating on behalf of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic colleagues, and the profiling of a good ally. Do you think it is possible for white people to become active race allies? What, in your view, makes a white person a good ally? Now, I want us to imagine a totally different scenario. Let's park all of that for a moment. Parliament enacted the Race Relations Amendment Act 2000 and required each public body, including higher education institutions, to have in place a race equality policy and action plan by 2002. And as Marcia said in her introduction, I was involved in assisting, advising on the Race Relations Amendment Act 2000. In 2002, I was commissioned by the Higher Education Funding Council for England, HEFCE, to evaluate the race equality policy and action plan of each HE institution in England. The following year, the Scottish Funding Council gave me a contract to do the same for their 20 universities. And in 2007, I did the same for the Funding Council in Wales. In Wales, I not only did evaluations, but engaged with each of the 14 universities to help refine their policies and their plans and provide guidance on implementation and particularly training on impact assessment. The template for ensuring legal compliance and for building a culture of equity had to take account of context in these respects, the relevance of what the university was doing and of the legislation for the functions of the institution, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute, relevance for consultation and communication with staff, with students, with its wider community, and relevance for impact assessment. I mentioned functions. A function is everything the university does in discharging its duties as a public body and a provider of services to its learning community and to society generally. And we can all reel off what I think functions are that universities perform. Admits students, appoints staff, formulates policies, designs and delivers curriculum, teaches and assesses students, appoints external examiners, awards degrees, engages in research, awards research contracts, awards fellowships and readerships, promotes internationalization, makes provision for supporting students, provides or outsources catering services, provides or outsources accommodation services, provides or outsources parking services, appoints members of the university council or governing body, and much more besides. These are all functions within the meaning of the Equality Act 2010. The Act requires the university, in carrying out those functions and all its other functions, to have due regard to the need to eliminate all forms of discrimination, harassment, and victimization, all of which are prohibited by the Equality Act 2010, advance equality of opportunity proactively by taking the sort of positive action Professor Blackman was talking about, and foster good relations. Equity values and anti-discrimination principles are essential to that whole process. The university needs to affirm that its approach to meeting the requirements of the legislation is to see the latter as a lever for building a culture of equity as a core underpinning value and defining and a defining feature of the institution, and ensuring that all students, staff, and members of the learning community, all, can work in an environment free of structural, cultural, institutional, and personal forms of discrimination and exclusion, and that all students, staff, and members of the learning community are made aware that they each have personal responsibility to create and sustain such an environment. Now, why is that important? It's important because those people who do not identify themselves, or whom we do not identify as allies in the struggle for racial justice, surely cannot be allowed to sail on regardless of what damage they're doing to Black and global majority students or staff colleagues. I mean, that is obvious. In other words, delivering people's rights cannot be contingent upon the disposition of individuals to either embrace this agenda or not. And that's what the law is there for. So when I talk about building a culture of equity and the law being a lever for that, is basically to say, if the Open University is delivering services to all people in the country and is employing BME or Black and global majority staff and students, it really has to ensure that irrespective of the disposition or outlook of every member of staff, whether they want to be considered white allies or not, they have a responsibility to act in a particular manner if they are going to continue to be employees of the Open University. They can't decide to stick two fingers up at the legislation, continue to indulge in racism, continue to undermine their colleagues, and function in a manner which suggests that they are the complete antithesis of what the values of the institution require and demand. And that is the difference between what I call the self-regulation and, you know, we are all reasonable people with a sense of moral purpose, and making sure that whatever people's disposition might be, they are compliant with legislation, they respect the rights and entitlements of people irrespective of their background and color or whatever else it may be, and can therefore, through what they do, provide evidence to the organization that it is actually making a difference and complying with legislation. So, this approach has therefore to inform and underpin the following processes: defining and prioritizing functions, defining equality objectives within each function, identifying activities in relation to those objectives, setting targets where appropriate, determining measures for assessing performance in meeting those objectives, including impact assessment, identifying success indicators, reflexively using the results of monitoring and assessment to enhance performance and eliminate barriers. And in all of that, it is the task of senior managers to seek to embed equality values and anti-discrimination principles and practice across all the university's functions and make them organic to the culture of the institution and the way it does its business as an organization. The Public Sector Equality Duty of the Equality Act 2010 mirrors the Race Relations Amendment Act of 2000 in that it has two parts: the general duty and the specific duties. The general duty sets out the equality matters that the institution needs to consider when making decisions that affect staff and students with different protected characteristics. And at this particular time, in the midst of an academic with all the horrors that is caused, while a lot of restructuring is going on within the sector, this becomes particularly important. How do you ensure that in your restructuring, the outcomes do not fall disproportionately on Black and global majority people? From 2000, the HE sector was required to have in place a race equality policy and action plan, as I said earlier. While I and several other analysts had no problem with the inclusion in the Single Equality Act of other groups with protected characteristics, and we know who those are, in addition to the historically oppressed by gender, race, disability, and sexual orientation, there was no evidence that public bodies as defined by the Race Relations Amendment Act 2000, including HE, had been sufficiently compliant with that legislation as to minimize what they were required to do to demonstrate compliance. The decision of the coalition government under Cameron and Clegg, therefore, to abandon the specific duties, i.e., to have in place and publish an equality action plan, conduct equality impact assessments as evidence of its insistence, the government's insistence, of getting rid of what they called red tape. In addition to introducing a light touch approach to enforcement, all of that was in essence a green light to public bodies and the HE sector among them to adopt a minimalist approach to promoting race equality and combating discrimination in its various manifestations. Meanwhile, having established the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the government promptly amputated it at its knees, resourcing it at a level that made it impossible for it to conduct even light touch enforcement. Despite growing evidence of the racism global majority staff and students continue to experience in the sector, our white allies continue to operate racist structures and to be complicit in the failure of the institutions to comply with legislation and build a culture of equity in which the rights of global majority staff and students could be safeguarded and their entitlements delivered. Small wonder then that global majority staff and students continue to experience racism in higher education after the Equality Act 2010, even more intensely than we did before. If our allies had demanded that their institutions desist from perpetuating racism and that they work towards building a culture of equity without having to be coerced by the Equality and Human Rights Commission to do so, they would not have needed the epiphany of George Floyd's murder and the mobilization of the Black Lives Matter movement to spring into action. So, for all of those reasons, it is against this backcloth that the sector vigorously embraced the new fad of unconscious bias training. Suddenly out went racism, structural, institutional, and otherwise, and in came unconscious bias. The problem with unconscious bias, of course, is that it is more often than not assumed to relate to the actions, behaviors, and decision-making of individuals as distinct from institutional structures, cultures, policies, processes, and practices. So for unconscious bias, and so for white allyship. I cannot for the life of me see why we should want to burden Black and global majority staff and students additionally with the task of nurturing and developing white allyship. God forbid that an industry would develop to institutionalize white allyship training with or without a merger with the now well-heeled and expanding industry in unconscious bias training. Finally, what's to be done? 20 years after the Race Relations Amendment Act of 2000 and 10 years after the Equality Act of 2010, neither of which has brought about the tangible changes African and global majority communities inside and external to the academy have a right to expect, it is absurd and grossly negligent for us to adopt and seek to own and nurture the new fad called white allyship. Rather, we should mobilize and act decisively to make two things happen. One, COVID has run a coach and horses through the financial forecasts of most higher education institutions. This moment of their unprecedented fragility surely is the time for us to compel government to impose swingeing financial penalties on institutions for the failure to provide evidence of complying with legislation and ensuring fair and equal access and equitable outcomes for African and global majority staff and students. If Boris Johnson is earnest in his intention to do something about racial disparities and about leveling up, this is an obvious place to start. Secondly, demand that government abandon all notions of self-regulation in the sector and put back what the coalition government removed when they enacted the Equality Act of 2010, namely the duty to publish a race equality policy and action plan, the setting of race equality objectives within each relevant function, race equality impact assessments to ensure that those objectives are having the results and outcomes intended, and that new policies and arrangements, including restructuring, would not disproportionately affect African and global majority people, requiring managers to provide evidence of legal compliance and culture change, including evidence of requiring each employee and each student to take personal responsibility for conducting themselves and carrying out their jobs or whatever in a manner consistent with eliminating racism and building a culture free from discrimination, harassment, and intimidation. We have had enough reports of AGM detriments and deficits in higher education. It would be utterly disgraceful, in my view, if we were to lean on the magnanimity of white privilege as a crutch to help us get through the hostile terrain of the academy, rather than demanding that the government takes measures to ensure that the sector guarantee and deliver our rights and entitlements, and that we are organized to collectively hold the sector to account. That is why this conference is so important and continues to be so important. That is why we need to make sure that after the conference and between now and the next one, we are putting measures in place to work with one another on this particular agenda to help change the narrative and get rid of these obfuscations of unconscious bias training and white allyship training and all of these other irrelevancies while we continue to be nailed to the wall. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gus. As always, on point, outstanding, profound keynote. So much love in the chat, and you have provoked so much conversation, so much discussion on so many of the points that you raised around allyship, training, I love the 2 points that you raised at the end as to what needs to be done, and I couldn't agree more. Professor Gus, we have 15 minutes for questions, and so I would like, if delegates have questions for Professor, could you please put them in the chat, and both Bernardine and I will monitor the chat and raise the questions that you ask. So, Professor Gus, while colleagues are putting questions in the chat, question for you on the first point, the second point that you raised with regards to race equality action plans. So, what are your thoughts on the race equality charter mark that Advance HE has, produced and is encouraging institutions to work towards those plans and submit? And the idea for colleagues or delegates who are not familiar with the Race Equality Charter Mark, it's a self-reflection of your institution. So it's a self-assessment, and you highlight where the inequalities are, and you design an action plan. It's a 3-year action plan to address those inequalities, those racial inequalities for staff and students. And it's a charter mark, so it's a bronze award, and then you can go for silver. So, Professor Gus, over to you. What are your thoughts around the Race Equality Charter Mark?
I have never been a fan of it. I think it is deficient. I think it is a poor substitute for what the Racist Relations Amendment Act 2000 required, as I have outlined in my presentation. It is voluntary, and I don't want to sound cynical. I never sound cynical, right? It is voluntary, but more than that, we know that many of those institutions love to have a whole roll call of achievements and awards and places and league tables and so on and so forth. And I believe that there are many institutions who chase the charter mark, whatever, gold, silver, bronze, whatever it is, in order to add to that list. It doesn't really, if they were to be granted it, even gold, I have to tell you, it would not necessarily reflect how Black and global majority people are treated within the organization. You can have an institution with a totally white senior leadership team, in spite of the fact that they've got 60% and more Black and global majority students getting, a silver standard for the what is that about? I mean, how can you qualify for the charter mark if there's that total disparity between your senior leadership team and their representation and the people who earn the money for them to get paid their salaries? It doesn't make sense. And what I'm saying really is, it is almost like the whole white allyship thing. It is not fixed in legislation. And I am not confident. I've been in this game since God knows when. My first lecturing job in a university was in 1977 at the University of Bradford. Yeah, and I'm still going very strong, and still have a lot of strength in my legs to kick ass when necessary. All right. So the point I'm making is, if you don't enshrine that stuff in legislation and demand that you see the evidence of what people are doing, so nobody could pull the wool over your eyes and write some grandiose application or whatever, make all kinds of claims about themselves that don't stand up to scrutiny by Black people themselves. Okay, I mean, I suppose it is a force for good rather than for evil, but it has, in my view, limited impact given the situation that we're actually dealing with in the sector.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got some questions coming in. First one from Dr. Winston Morgan. How much damage do you think the recent race disparities report has done to the challenges we face in higher education? So that's the CRED report that was published at the end of March. Dr. Tony Sewell.
Well, I mean, I would like to think that it hasn't done a lot of damage because too many of us have ignored it and debunked it as a load of nonsense. If we do that and determine that we have to change that narrative and not allow the government to believe that what is in that report should set its agenda, then we are concentrating on our business and making sure we get that business right, rather than spending a whole heap of time on these diversions of Johnson and Tony Sewell and other such misguided people.
Lovely. Another question for you, Professor Gus. Do we need a national AGM HE experience survey?
Well, I'm not quite sure about that. I mean, if one were to do a literature search, you come up with all sorts of stuff that goes back to, you know, God knows when, including recent ones, that recent stuff about racial harassment and so on and so forth. My concern about all of that is that it takes a bit of the sector from time to time, scrutinizes it, turns it inside out, reports more and more of the experiences of Black and global majority staff or students, as the case may be, without there necessarily being a guarantee that whatever recommendations there are would be acted upon, or that the individual institutions would provide evidence of what they would do in response to the reports. So I think people would be diffident about, if you like, a nationwide inquiry of that sort. It would be very telling, but I think in as much as we can more or less predict what the outcomes of that would be, what is the point of doing it? I would sooner concentrate on getting the government to take the actions I have called for in my paper, and then we can be assured that when we do the survey, what we'll be looking at is what returns have people submitted to government, how are they speaking to progress or lack of it, and what we collectively as a body within the sector can do. I think it's much more important for us to plan as Black and global majority people in the sector, how we collectivize ourselves in the belief that we can take collective action and bring about change. So how we collectivize ourselves nationally. I mean, okay, so we are members of UCU or whatever else it may be. That's one thing. I'm talking about independent organization in our own right because of what we experience within the sector and what we think the sector ought to be doing for the country. I mean, Professor Blackman talked about it, that the sector has got a societal function in a racist society. It's not one that it is embracing. So I would prefer us to be collectivizing ourselves, using our energies, helping to change the narrative, setting the agenda, rather than having to respond to foolishness like that wretched Sewell report.
Okay, I think we've got time for a couple more questions. One from Augustine Limor. Is Professor Gus involved with working with universities that want to do anti-racism work, as it feels like the intentions to do this work aren't always followed up with impactful action? So can you talk a little bit about the work that you have done in universities and whether you feel that within those institutions there has been any change.
Okay. The short answer is that after I did that national evaluation for these various funding councils, I provided a confidential evaluation report to each institution and went through it with their leadership teams. But then I also provided a cross-sector report for the individual funding councils. Following on that, I was asked to look at a sample of institutions across the sector and see how far they'd got. There were those who actually asked for my intervention to assist them in doing a kind of audit, organizational audit, and determining where else they were to go. The problem I think we have is this, that in situations where, like at the Open University, you have a Tim Blackman, and particular disposition, direction of travel, etc. If all the things that Tim was sharing with us this morning aren't reflected in or translated into policies, practices, structures that sustain them and help them to sustain the culture that he's seeking to build, then what you find is another person might come in. They might have a corporate mindset as if they're running Google or something, rather than running an educational establishment. And their priorities might be very, very different. I have examined some corporate plans and strategic priorities of institutions in the sector, and frankly, I'm ashamed. They are bereft of issues to do with social justice and righting racial wrongs and so on and so forth. So as you were saying when you introduced Tim Blackman, leadership is critical in all of this, but it has to be distributed leadership, not just the leadership of the vice chancellor or president or provost or whatever, but across the piece, senior leadership team, middle leadership teams, and so on. And that is not that's what we don't get right enough. And consequently, you know, there are peaks and troughs and there are fads depending upon who is setting the agenda and what priorities they are setting for the institution. Because it is very easy for students of whatever color or ethnicity, and indeed staff, to be seen as peripheral to all of that. What matters is that grand plan that the particular vice chancellor might have. I mean, I can name some examples, but it would be imprudent to do that.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great note to end on. Professor Gus, thank you once again for that outstanding keynote. It is always, always a pleasure to hear you, as I said before, speak truth to power. You know, you shone a guiding light very early for me in my career. I remember hearing you speak, it was over 20 years ago. And I'm so honored to be able to share this stage with you and hear you once again today. So thank you for all that you do across the sector and beyond. We are really indebted to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.